right, thank you for joining us today for the School of Creative Practice Research Showcase. This is the fourth showcase that we've had this year, and we've had some great interest and registrations pretty much taking us through to October. So we are, I think, set to roll these out pretty much at the end of each month now until October, which is terrific. Today we are welcoming Elizabeth Gibbs, a lecturer in dance, who will be giving us a 30-minute presentation titled Programming Value for Australian Contemporary Dance. Elizabeth will give her presentation. We have some Zoom participants. The whole session will be recorded, and this will be part of a research asset that we're building in the School of Creative Practice. Following a brief Q&A on Elizabeth's presentation, we have Dr. David Megarrity, Senior Lecturer in Drama, and David will be presenting on Memorial Hall, a research project funded by the Australia Council, centred on creative practice research and myth-making, news and propaganda. So I'll let David extend that more on his presentation. But we appreciate you coming physically into the room today while we still can. It's great that we can all get together and be here and support our staff and colleagues in these presentations. And we get an insight into the diversity of the research that's happening across our 9 disciplines in our very exciting school. So with that in mind, I will hand over to Elizabeth and we'll kick off the proceedings. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I just wanted to start off by saying it's such an amazing thing for me to have an opportunity to talk about my research, because I have very, very little opportunity to talk about research. And for me, perhaps even less so, because my supervisors are either in Berlin or Melbourne, and I've had very little contact with them over the past, well, since COVID, obviously. I've got programming value for Australian contemporary dance. I popped the word value in there, because when you start to research programming, a lot of the discourse is around value, and it's around who values what for whom, and what is thought of as valuable content for our stages and why. And I thought I'd start off just by introducing myself, and I know that you all know me, but in some ways it's my background that's led me into this research. So I'm a contemporary dancer, or I probably should say I was a contemporary dancer, and I worked in London for a long time with a company there called Rombe, who are known as Britain's leading contemporary dance company, and they're a repertoire company. So in that company, you get to perform works by many, many different choreographers, and they tour all over the world. And then I left Rombe and I went into kind of arts management, and I made my way back to Australia, and I joined Australian Dance Theatre, which is also one of Australia's leading contemporary dance companies, and I joined as their Associate Artistic Director. Based in South Australia. While I was working for them, a lot of my time was spent in the studio with the dancers making work, but I became kind of fascinated or slightly frustrated perhaps at what ADT weren't doing in the audience development space and what they weren't doing in our own state. So I started ADT's audience development program, and I did a couple of sort of big projects under that banner. One time I went out to regional South Australia, to Port Augusta, and I made a work there with community, sort of singers and writers and projection artists, musicians and dancers, as part of what was then the inaugural South Australian City of Culture, which is kind of a European model that's been really successful in Europe for places like Glasgow, for instance, was a European City of Culture, where there's a kind of critical mass of arts people on the ground, and they go in and they will put a lot of money into one locale and leave them with better infrastructure, which is kind of what happened in Port Augusta. However, in a regional town, there's often less kind of arts workers on the ground. So what they ended up with was a jazzed up town hall, and ADT didn't go there. And then another time I took a kind of choreographic mission across the Nullarbor to work with groups of students in really small towns just before you get to kind of Head of Bite, trying to teach them what contemporary dance felt like from the inside, because I knew they danced, but they'd never seen contemporary dance, because we didn't go there either. And South Australia has a lot, I mean, it has kind of a legacy of built infrastructure. It's got what we call the Big Four that were kind of bequeathed to the state, for want of a better word, by Don Dunstan. So we've got 4 big kick-ass performing arts centres that ADT never went to. Now, ADT, I once described it as a touring machine. We toured to Europe year in, year out, often for 3 months at a time. And we performed in Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide. But during my 11-year tenure there, we toured in Australia once. And that was a tour that I helped to set up. So I kind of was like, what's going on here? Why is it that when I'm knocking on presenters' doors saying, will you take us? You know, we're not bad, we're quite good. We sell out in France and Germany and wherever. And I kind of get the eye roll, or I'd be at performing arts markets, you know, doing the same thing and getting a similar reaction. So the kind of overarching question for my research is, how do presenters here in Australia make their decisions when programming contemporary dance in Australian performing arts centres? And the focus of the research is quite specific in that it really looks at how they program across a year. So as distinct from a festival program, which presenters will tell you is kind of there's a different kind of presenting context to the festival. There's some research around it's more marketable, audiences will travel, it's kind of a destination address, and audiences for festivals might be more open to more challenging or riskier work, potentially. The other thing is that this research is really only looking at work that's programmed from the subsidized arts sector. So it's not looking at the work coming from the commercial sector. And the difference, there's a really distinct difference between the relationships that work from the commercial sector has with the performing arts or centre compared to productions from the subsidized arts sector. The commercial work, which tends to be kind of your big comedies, your big musical theatre, they will pay money to rent the PAC, the Performing Arts Centre. So some presenters refer to them as their bread and butter. They will come in, it will almost be like a hall for hire. They'll come in, they'll pay money to be there. They'll bring their own crew, they take care of all of their marketing material. So they're less of a risk. In fact, some presenters use that kind of revenue to support their arts programs. Whereas productions that come from the subsidized arts sector, presenters will pay them to come and perform. They will provide a crew, they'll help them with their marketing, and they hope to God they sell enough tickets to kind of cover their costs. Now, there are many kind of business models within those two paradigms, but they're the kind of most obvious, distinct ways of categorizing how much risk is involved in programming something. So when you're looking at work from the subsidized arts sector, there's a lot more risk involved. I interviewed in 2019, so pre-COVID, about a third of all of the presenters in Australia working in performing arts centres that program contemporary dance. So that kind of sounds like a lot. It's actually not. Because there are a lot of performing arts centres that won't touch contemporary dance with a barge pole. So I talked to a lot of the presenters over the phone, partly because I didn't really want to fly all around the country. I wanted to kind of get it done, but partly because I kind of knew them anyway from trying to setting up tours. So it wasn't as if I was talking to people I'd never met or who didn't know me and I didn't know them. And then this year, I've also kind of gathered some quantitative data. So I've counted during a set period of time the amount of contemporary dance that is programmed in 2021 across 30 performing arts centres. And I've also asked some of my kind of research cohort to send me data, the ones that were able to, about their subsidized programs from 2017, 18 and 19. And what I've kind of been able to prove through that is that contemporary dance is quite marginalized. And I kind of knew that already, but I now have pie charts. So this is the, it shows you the amount of contemporary dance, which I haven't named here, but it's the kind of little biscuit, in comparison to the amount of theatre that's been programmed across 30 performing arts centres this year. And then if we go on through the data, now this is from the subsidised arts programme, so you can see there's a mix there. There's also not much circus, however, there's less circus around than there is contemporary dance at the moment. I mean, you can watch this space. Opera, mainly Opera Australia. It will sometimes go into the regions. It's more likely to be found in the state-run performing arts centres, the same with ballet. Comedy often sits in the commercial sector and isn't often found in the subsidised sector. Same very much with musical theatre and cabaret. And so it's kind of sitting at around about 3%. And I've compared it to theatre because a lot of theatre, or most theatre, and this might be a contestable point, comes from the subsidised sector. So in a way, they're in a similar boat. Two of these venues were council-run venues. One was in a regional centre that was very much kind of an agricultural hub. One was a council-run centre that's peri-urban, so on the edge of a large city. One of them was in an urban centre that's very, very near to a big capital city. And it was run by a theatre company. And there is another venue that is a tiny little venue, also run by a theatre company. So there's various models for running, and it's interesting. You can find out more about a performing arts centre if they're not run by a council. If they are run by a council and you go into their annual reports, they will not get much of a mention, which I found interesting. So when I was thinking about what I was going to tell you about this research, at the moment, I'm in that kind of icky yucky stage in my PhD where everything feels kind of like this. And I've got all the information in my head and I want to tell you everything. But obviously I've had to be quite judicious about what I talk about. And if I did tell you everything, we'd be here until next week and we'd all get very hungry. I've said that the research foregrounds diversity, cultural democracy, and different interpretations of artistic excellence within the various stages of the cultural cycle. And the cultural cycle has been kind of defined, as it were, by UNESCO, so that we can talk about that process from kind of making to adding production values, to marketing, to performing. And some of what I'm going to talk about probably won't end up in my thesis, perhaps because it's too contestable, but they are in a way the things that interest me the most. And I'm probably also going to conflate ideas of artistic excellence with value. So contemporary dance strives to make art. It can be rebellious, it's kind of anti-mainstream, subversive, powerful, messy, sweaty, and political. It can be beautiful, but it also can be ugly. And I thought rather than me trying to tell you what great contemporary dance looks like, I might just show you a little bit. So please bear with me if we run into some technical difficulties here, because this is not as easy as it would seem. So the first clip that I'm going to show you is from a maker based in Sydney, who you may have seen here once. She was asked to make a work on the Brisbane-based company Australasian Dance Collective. Her name is Stephanie Lake. This piece is called Colossus, and one of the reasons why I like it is because she's basically showing us her idea of what humanity looked like as this kind of mass of beings, and what can happen within a mass when perhaps too many people have one ideology and there are very few with another. This is kind of like the edited cricket highlights of this little clip. It's her promo, and it went viral on Facebook. She had, I don't know how many millions of likes, and this little version here has got 17,400 likes. And she's just restaged this work in Paris. Stephanie Lake's Colossus, and you can see how kind of rich with imagery it is, and how it is not in narrative form, but the audience end up with this kind of overwhelming sense of what Stephanie is trying to talk about. And then the next little clip that I have here, I can get to it, is this amazing man, whose name, he goes by the name of Rubber Legs. And the reason I'm playing you this clip is really just to demonstrate to you, I guess, what level of ingenuity physical thinking can result in. And so it goes. Thank you. Just gonna switch back to my PowerPoints. Great. When the Australia Council talk about artistic excellence, they tend to talk about artistic vibrancy. And I'm not going to talk about all of the problems with the term artistic excellence because it's a huge conversation. However, they talk about, and they have this kind of artistic vibrancy kit that performing arts organizations can use to kind of assess where they're at, benchmark where they're at. And they talk about demonstrating integrity of process, excellence of craft, imagination, distinctiveness, and ingenuity. And when you're watching these two clips that I've shown you, I think you can see the level of ingenuity involved, the sorts of things they're potentially striving for as artists. They're striving to make art, not entertainment. However, the two are obviously not necessarily mutually exclusive. But when you talk to presenters, when I've talked to presenters about programming and how they choose what they're going to put on their stages, I sort of thought I'd have a lot of conversations about art. And I didn't. So presenters, I did a bit, but not anything like as much as I thought. So presenters told me that at first they tried a program for broad appeal. So across a number of genres for broad appeal. And the word broad appeal was used a lot. And for me, that kind of speaks to a little bit mainstream, a little bit middle of the road. They are very much drawn to the two major performing arts board companies, Sydney Dance Company and Bangarra Dance Theatre, which are excellent companies. But they have very strong brands. And therefore, because of the draw of programming something with a strong brand, because it's less risky, because you need to make sure you cover those costs, the most programmed remain the most programmable. And I haven't shown you the data for this, but when you're looking at what contemporary dance, who's going where, when, one, you'll see that there's not a lot of contemporary dance programmed anywhere. It's kind of one or two shows a year, but most of those are Sydney Dance Company or Bangarra. Now, I've sat on the Australia Council Peer Assessment and Australia Council Dance Board, and I've seen the kind of richness of the contemporary dance makers and the number of voices coming across our desks. And yet there is so little of that that's getting more than, we'll give you money to be made, we'll give you money for your first show, and then you will go nowhere, or they will go overseas. And I guess in some ways that's why I'm saying that this really foregrounds diversity, in that there is at the moment quite a lack of diversity in the types of contemporary dance voices that people are seeing. But there's more. So presenters have told me that they prefer narrative work with lots of bodies on stage that do virtuosic movement and have strong, effective marketing collateral. Now, as creative practitioners, I think it's kind of tricky when you're in an environment where there is a real criteria around how your work is going to be selected. because not all contemporary dance companies or producers can afford lots of bodies on stage. They're not all interested in virtuosic movement, and they don't all want to do a narrative. And a lot of us actually think that contemporary dance doesn't do narrative very well anyway. An overwhelming number of presenters, as I've said, talked about their audiences. So there's a very audience-centric nature to the presenting model. Now, one of the other things I looked at in this research was the overlay of cultural policy on the performing arts environment. This is kind of the benchmarks, I think you would say, that within this kind of performing arts environment that presenters are using, benchmarks of audience accessibility, affordability, and saleability. And I haven't talked much about affordability, but contemporary dance, unfortunately, is also rather expensive. It takes a long time to get into a theatre, and dancers need lots of time on stage. I popped this slide in here, partly because of where we are, and partly because I suppose we've benefited in a way from this legacy. And I know this is historic, but I wanted to draw your attention, and I know you can all read this, to a sentence in the center where Stuart Cunningham's talking about shifting, so the creative industries paradigm is shifting the arts out of the kind of subsidy and dependence portfolios to those of economic development and emerging industries. The creative industries was a very, very successful model. And I was living in London in the 1990s, and I remember hearing Tony Blair talking about the creative industries and New Labour and over and over and over again. It was very successful from an economic point of view. And of course, it was seeded in some ways here by Paul Keating at that time. One of the things that kind of, I guess, solidified creative industries was the one and only federal cultural policy that Australia have managed to pass through Parliament, that being Creative Nation. And I know that we're going even further back in time now to 1992. But Creative Nation talked very clearly saying this is an economic policy as well as a cultural policy. And they called for a shift away from a focus on production and kind of elite nurturing towards distribution. But my question is, what happens to a niche genre such as contemporary dance inside of a creative industries paradigm that is really looking to putting power into the hands of the consumer? So what the majority of people want is what the majority of people will get. And one of the presenters I spoke to, I mean, this is a direct quote, she says she's guided very much by the saleability of her work. And of course, by bums on seats. And I'm just going to flick through this slide in case anyone finds it offensive. What's happening is, because of the risk involved in programming contemporary dance, because presenters are tending to lean towards these two major performing arts board companies, audience in Australia are not getting diverse content, but they're also getting a very, very narrow idea of what contemporary dance looks like. However, there are some good things happening. So one of the good things that happened in 2020, which is not a lot of good things happened in 2020, but one of the good things that happened in 2020 was there was a touring scan, and it was done by Culture Counts. And what they found, kind of comfortingly for me, was some of my findings very much align with theirs. One sort of significant finding was that presenters in some ways are hamstrung by the environment within which they are programming. And there is no shortage of ambition, but the corporatization of the performing arts industry, this kind of entertainment model for programming, really affects what they can choose to program. And I know the corporatization of the performing arts industry, it sounds like a soundbite. So what does that look like on the ground? And when I was talking to them, it's to do with their reporting models, the boards with the very strongly governance-focused boards, and the influence of their boards on their programming decisions. People were saying things like, their boards say, well, why are you programming that if you're only getting 200 people into an 800-seater? The other thing that's happened, which is really exciting, is that the Major Performing Arts Board has been shaken up significantly, and it's changed its name. I think it's called the Performing Arts Touring Framework. but it's brought into the fold two really exciting contemporary dance companies. One is Dance North that live up the road in Townsville. And the other is a company which I love called Megarrity, and they are an Indigenous and non-Indigenous contemporary dance company. They make work that is kind of raw and charged and political and performs quite a lot overseas. However, you probably haven't seen them in Brisbane. And that's because of the QCAP presenting model. So I guess what I want to be really clear as I'm kind of winding up is I don't want to leave this kind of on a doomful note. I think there is hope, and some of my findings have been around how to mitigate and shift this paradigm. However, I suppose unless there's a kind of a consensus amongst presenters across the country, because you always have your mavericks, to change the way that performing arts is selected, and obviously unless there's more money to support those decisions at all, this paradigm will take a very long time to shift. So that's everything I have to say. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have some questions, I'd love to hear them.
We've got about 2 minutes for
interesting
questions, or you can think about it and you can do it after both presentations. So. I'll throw in the one. Did I miss? I was sitting here looking at all of this, Elizabeth. The big four that you mentioned at Adelaide, that was the legacy from Don Dutton. Yeah. Sorry, what were they?
What were they? Sorry, they are performing arts centres. So I'm trying to remember where they are. There's one in Renmark, one in Whyalla, one in Port Pirie, and one in down south on the way to Victoria. Big performing arts centres, but we call them the big four. Right, yeah.
So you don't count the metropolitan one like LA Festival Centre.
I think the LA Festival Centre was being built during that time. So one of the things I didn't say just quickly is I've talked to presenters in all sorts of levels of performing arts centres, from your big state kind of monolith kick-ass to tiny little regional centres. And so, yeah, the big four in South Australia, though, are not those big ones. Yeah, they're regional.
Sorry. This might be a little bit outside the scope, but I just wondered if digital adaptation offered any kind of pathway for getting, word out.
It's interesting that you said this, because this is why I want to finish my PhD so fast, because this is where I want to go next. So the Australia Council are actually doing some really good work in that space at the moment, and also Performing Arts Connections, which is the peak body for performing arts centres. And I think at their upcoming conference this year, quite a lot of it is around digital content. And so all performing arts, or a lot, are really moving into that space, and some are doing it better than others, but heavens, yes. I think in some ways, if you're staying within this kind of economic rationalized paradigm, which we don't seem to be leaving in a hurry with our present government, the only way really to protect a niche art form in that way is to try and take it onto another performance platform where it's getting more distribution. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that space.
In the room and also on Zoom, I'm really glad to be here today. Thank you for being here in person and online. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land upon which we meet, which have always been places of teaching and learning and continue to be. But also, as we reflect on the many layers of this land, we can think about the former purpose of this. Before it was a place of university, it was actually a barracks. And so appropriately enough, maybe this is a military themed presentation. So yes, here we are in the School of Creative Practice, and this presentation is entirely focused on creative practice. And I don't really make any excuses for that, because I reckon we should really privilege that, given the name of our school. That's what if we had a door, that's what it would say on our door. Yes, I'm here part-time, but I'm also a playwright in my other life, and also in this life as well too. And I'm a musician and performer as well. And I've had a past life as a filmmaker. Generally speaking, I tend to incorporate some sort of film into my performance practice as well too. Last year, Queensland Premier's Drama Award-winning production of The Holidays happened at Queensland Theatre, and that was a work that incorporated screen and design and music and live performance in quite a complicated and sublime way. This work contains those elements as well too, but I'll describe them now as I move on. Okay, but we're all in the same boat here because there are creative practitioners here in this space, and we understand that the act of creative practice can actually be framed as, and is always, an act of research. But at the same time, I also want to talk about how this practice-led research, but there's also research-led practice, and those things are separate domains. The idea of going to the library or the online equivalent, and then the artistic stuff, they're not different domains, they're the same. They're in a binary orbit and they're often symbiotic in a way that's not usually noticed in the final event. I'll be tracking how particular work, which I'm in the middle of at the moment, is going to take shape, and how that's emerged and how its creative conceptualization has taken place, and how some of this research assists what I think will be a connection to some of the bigger conversations. And also to the art of the proposal. It goes without saying that some of our undergraduate students eventually suffer from a disorder which is called proposal fatigue. A lot of the time in the BFA, they're asked to propose new works. And I also think that there's a place for us as researchers and creative practitioners to teach them some of those skills about writing creative proposals, because essentially sometimes the writing around a work can be more important than the writing in it. Okay. So some details, because behind every act of research stands the biography of the researcher, and that not only changes how you arrive at the research question, but also how you observe the lenses through which you view the research material. And these are sort of little creative moments, some of which are biographical. I grew up in an army town in Townsville. I used to think it would be a good idea to join the army when I grew up, until it was pointed out to me they don't really like doing what I'm told, which is a key task in the army. I made a film with some friends, which went to the Cannes Film Festival, but the shoot was a debacle. So there was an interesting dichotomy there between the making and the showing, and also the level of interest around the work. No one wants to know about the debacle. Everyone wants to know about the Cannes bit. There's a sort of hero narrative implicitly, which I've never told. I'm a father, and you take your children along to various events, or the children in your care. You take them to a Labor Day march, or you take them to an Anzac Day march, and sometimes you think, when you've got the park and it's raining and they're on your shoulders and you found a good posse, what am I doing here? Dad, I'm hungry. What am I doing here? What else have I got here? My wife's a New Zealander, and it's interesting the way that our museums frame our history, particularly our military history, because the New Zealand wars between the British settlers and the Maori are privileged in their history, but don't appear at all in the Australian War Memorial's history. So I think there's an interesting dichotomy there in the way the stories are told and not told as well too. I went to an exhibition in Acme down in Melbourne, City of Love, and it really sparked a couple of these fragments and got me thinking about a play that I might write. Recently I was on tour. Oh yes, I was on tour. And I was in Perth, and I was browsing the Edward bookshop, and my bandmate started teasing me because I was being an archetypal middle-aged man, because I was looking at a doorstopper book of military history to while away the long flight. And I said, it's not what you think, it's for a play. He said, no, you're a middle-aged man. Soon you'll be buying vintage sound technology. And he was right. Down here, though, is a red asterisk, and that's a space for my family members and everything they told me about their military experience, which was nothing. So, Memorial Hall, formerly known as Longshot. I'll tell you why I changed the name presently. You've probably seen this footage before from the Gallipoli landings of April 25, 1915. Really important, pivotal moment in our Australian history, depending on how you look at it. But if you've seen this footage, you haven't seen Gallipoli, because there were no cameras at the landing, because it happened at 4 in the morning and was pretty dangerous. What you're looking at, and this is often mistaken for documentary footage, is still from a film called Hero of the Dardanelles, which I referred to earlier in the presentation, which was actually shot 2 months after the actual Gallipoli battle off the coast of Sydney at Tamarama Bay. And it was one of 2 reenactments of the Gallipoli battle. And I started to think, what an interesting place to set the play. That's what I started to think about. And the fragments started to come into order there. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that play. Maybe we'll have a closer look at the hypotext in a minute. What an interesting place to start a play. But also, too, in this boat, what an interesting place for a nation to be born. A group of white men in a boat about to invade a country. Young adolescent men doing what they're told. That's a peculiar place for a country to be born. And there's something about the extreme dramatic focus of this idea that kind of neutralizes the very hot ideological territory of this Anzac legend, to which some people might subscribe full well, other people might have a more left-leaning view. And I'm not interested in doing theatre and education for adults. I want to create something that's really interesting that could stimulate all audiences of all ages. And there's a dramatic irony about these images, is that the people now, not just because of history, but for other reasons, well, we know more about this event than the people who are in it. And I want to carry that property through its dramatic interpretation. How's this going so far, all right?
Yeah.
Right, cool. So it was called long shot, which of course is a cinematographic term, but as I applied for more and more sort of grants and support, I thought it was probably psychologically not a good idea to call the project long shot. But Memorial Hall is actually a better title for reasons that will become clear. Here's a poster of the film. It was actually made with the made by a freelance filmmaker, but it was made with the full cooperation of the government, because the people in the film were actually soldiers. They were trainee soldiers training out at Liverpool, who were taken in by train, put in these boats, and then invaded Australia, and then went back to training, and then were taken off to war. Some to Gallipoli, but most to the Western Front. So that's quite an interesting idea. There was actually a sequel. It was kind of The Empire Strikes Back. There was another film called Will They Never Come, which was a sequel to it. It's highly popular. The early part of the war, when everyone was really into it. I'm just trying to suppress the nerd in me right now. So let's have a quick look at the hypertext. Now, this is from the Australian National Film and Sound Archive. It's a fragment of a film. Most of the film was lost, and it's been reconstructed. So I'll just give you a bit of a sense of what it looks like. It's got some really hokey music associated with it, because obviously it was a silent film. It would have been not in the Zoom, that's probably so this dramatic footage of on the day in Sydney. I've looked into some films with and one that's been having a comedy in Sydney. The residents of Sydney think they look like food. So it came to Egypt and like and they died. Of course, they made it Australia. I'm interested also to how they decided who was going to die. Because it's vintage filmmaking, it's quite hokey. It's actually a particular moment I want to show you. Which is coming up soon. As is quite common in Australian cinema, propaganda films actually is really big part of the future. And there were lots of of course, in Australia, they were defending this. Of course, this battleship is cutting from some other film. You can see that Turks as well too. I'm interested in how they decided who did that in the Turks. Keeping an eye on one particular side. It's coming up pretty soon. I think it's very inspiring. Here are the Turks. Now, so they might have been darker than this, or maybe they were a bit dark, I'm not sure, but it's quite peculiar. They got zapped. guy, he's a bit shot, he lies on the rock, and then there's this But this film was hugely popular. It got men a lot. It was made by professional filmmakers. So who are these actors? Who are these people? They're already in the army, they're sitting in the boat, they're ready to go. They don't know much about the war, they don't know much about the basic. This dramatic focus neutralizes the war. So, research is bound up in the creative practice, and I became a bit of a nerd for it, like you tend to do. Quite often there's the creative practice and there's the exegetical element, this moment here. I often write a lot around my work. Because of the nature of this work, I'm not going to provide a lot of exegetical material when I write about it. I want the work to stand for itself. So what did I do? I'm just going to move out of shot for a minute so I can look at my own notes here. Yeah, so I'm inscribing the challenges of the material. You know, not much is going to happen in this play. I quite like plays in which not much happens. And I'm going to write another one of those. So it makes clearly an absurd piece, but I don't just want to be sort of facile about that. Filmmaking was once described as a series of long waits interrupted by a number of repetitions. And very much that's the structure of the play. It's quite a musical play. So, you know, what do? I watch lots of war films. And of course, you know, they're mostly made by men who are basically having ego trips, using the machine of the cinema to do essentially to their audiences what war did to people without killing them. And, you know, the moral of these things is war is hell. And, you know, as we used to say in grade 10, I'm not interested in those cliches, except ironically. But also at the same time, I don't want a good giant, what you call it, a editorial hand pointing to the dramatic meaning of the work, because my audience is adults as well. So I read the screenplay as well too. The screenplay of Hero of Dardanelles is actually written, and as it says, from the accounts of Ashmead Bartlett, who wrote the account of the Gallipoli landings from a boat 6 miles offshore. They said his eyesight must have been extremely good. So it's a highly jingoistic work. I'm also looking at psychological theories related to these protagonists of the work. They're young men. Erik Erikson says that at that stage, you're looking at identity and role confusion. If there are nations being born in this space, does this mean we're forever adolescents? You know, we teach adolescents, and, you know, who would want to stay in that stage? I look at critical histories of the key event, both, you know, the Peter Fitzsimons book that I read at the airport, but also stuff by Henry Reynolds and others, which, you know, sort of describe both ends of the debate. And I also look at the Indigenous experience of World War I. That's something I'm really interested to explore, but of course, I'm a 52-year-old white man. I need to do that with care. I met a key expert in the field, the man who actually reconstructed that film with another academic, Daniel Raynaud. I went down to Newcastle to meet with him, and he was like, we nerded out on it totally. And he showed me other moments where stuff was faked in a far more egregious way than this, but I won't tell you that story now. Now, obviously, the hero's journey isn't going to work well for this absurd work, but there's a nice congruence between narrative and what I'm trying to do. These guys aren't heroes, they're extras. They never make the hero shot, as it were. So I'm interested in that. And even Christopher Vogler, when he was talking about the hero's journey, after he toured the work for a little while, in the forward to a later edition, he said, you know, hero's journey doesn't work for all nations. There's a place called Australia where they celebrate a military failure as a sort of great national celebration. And they're interested in, you know, how can the hero's journey sort of be put on top of that? It's quite an uncomfortable sort of narrative structure. So there might be some irony there. I'm interested in finding the form. The Holidays combined all of those art forms all the way through, which is very complicated and didn't sit very well with sort of a mainstream theatre company. So I'm looking to sort of focus the intermediality of this work right at the conclusion of the work. I also have to consider the context. If I'm critiquing the perpetuation of Anzac-ery, as it's sometimes known, by creating yet another work that critiques it, am I just doing the same thing again? And then I write stuff as well too, that's important. After nerding out, you've got to write a play, and that's how I do it. I wrote it as unattributed dialogue. Also, I look at primary text as well too. You can see this is actually a diary entry from a man who was part of the shoot. Percy Smythe, that's the only diary entry I found that makes direct reference to the shoot. Okay, so what this extreme dramatic focus allows me to do, and this is Will, the protagonist of Heroes of the Dardanelles, is to play these ideological concerns with a straight bat. Because all of these war films, as you probably know, use sporting metaphors. I think that's important. So I created a first draft, which had a lot of holes in it. But there's also kind of a vernacular symbolism that started to arrive. What are men doing about who are just waiting for something to happen? They might experiment with fishing. Fishing sort of becomes a bit of a metaphor for propaganda, baiting, catching people. And also they've got to kill the fish too. So they're dealing with, and they're working out who's going to die. How do they work out who's going to die? Who's actually going to have that smoke when they're lying on the rock? The dialogue was unattributed, so I just wrote the dialogue, but wasn't sure who was going to say it. I thought we'll get into a room and work it out. Thanks, COVID. So we couldn't get in a room. There's also a really interesting ideological knot around depictions of racism in the work. It's not a major theme, but I'm interested in being quite real about what might have actually happened in that boat. Also, too, this particular draft was overly epistolary because some of the source material I used was letters. People wrote letters a lot in that time. So that's where you get the voice of the characters I'm interested to explore. But the voice that's written down is not the same as the voice that's spoken. So yeah, I'll change the title as well. Yeah, so I've read, this draft was actually set in a boat. I thought I'll put a boat on stage, but then I changed my mind. Because the men of Heroes of Dardanelles are reenacting the battle, right? But I thought, why don't we get a group of people to reenact the reenactment of the battle? That's where it started to get exciting for me and super meta. Group of people in a hall at some time later in the future who are reenacting the group of people who are reenacting something. And there's my little rough drawing of what that might kind of look like. So I sought support. You can see there are actually 9 applications over a couple of years, and that's pretty common. A couple of them sort of happened. But each application involved a return to the source material to keep going, oh, right, okay, it is a bit meta. How do I communicate this to people who neither know nor care what I'm going on about? Yeah. This is a memorial hall. Have you ever been in a memorial hall? They're everywhere. They're hard to avoid, aren't they? So a really important part of our sort of the architecture of our society. But notice here the honour rolls blank at this stage, and up here they're being watched by the king, who of course is the cousin of the Kaiser that they're fighting at the time. Okay, then the work starts to take shape a little bit more. And this is a memorial hall down the road from my place where I do yoga and my son used to do taekwondo. So a group called Elbow Room in Melbourne had some development money, which COVID made them pivot quickly towards an online development. What this mess of a play that I really had in my hands needed was someone to read it. So there was an online reading with a diverse group of young men, including an Indigenous actor. And it's got a little bit of dramaturgical feedback. It was an excuse to work out who said what. And there was a woman involved in the project as well too. It's a very, very male kind of project. And she said, it read to me initially like I hate plays where this whole bunch of guys just talking about stuff. We all know those kind of plays. She went, actually, I worried it was going to be one of those, but it's better. I thought, well, that's good. And then after that, I went, okay, there is a play here. Someone else has read it. They've got really good feedback for me. And I created another character called Maintenance. At an earlier draft, I thought there might be about 10 people in the play. Then I wanted to enter it into the Griffin Playwriting Award, and that year had to have 4 people in it. It had to be funny. That was very focusing as well. So anyway, that's where we are. But now there's a character called Maintenance who wanders around the hall and helps them maintain the legend, as it were. Yeah. There's also a clarity of a false ending. I want the actual invasion, or when the cue comes for them to invade Tamarama, I want it to be a complete debacle. I want it to be quite a physical theatre piece. But the lovely thing is that unlike a real battle, you can reset, no one dies. Then they reset, and there's a beautiful moment of spectacle, I think, where the real film plays here. The windows fill with scene, and there's a point where they actually do what I just did and go, that's me. I think that would be really nice and quite sad in a way when you consider that probably most of them would have died in the war that they were publicised. So that's kind of poignant, isn't it? Have I said anything I wanted to say? Yeah, almost, I think. So the most recent application that I made, the one that sort of hoved off anything really to do with research and gave a significant writer's fee discount, was the one that got funded. So what that means, that's from the Australian Council Literature Board, so the 9th of 9 applications, means that I am able to write 2 more drafts of the work, so I'm getting about half a commission fee for that. I get to work with some actors for 2 lots of 3 hours and a director. And I'll get to work with 2 dramaturgs, Peter Matheson and Isaac Drandich, who's an Indigenous come to. The other thing is that instead of trying to sort of puppet master some of these sort of ethnic and Indigenous concerns through the casting of the work, I'm going to make it gender and colour diverse. It's meant to reflect the diversity of Australia. So I fully expect that people reenacting the reenactment could be a young Asian woman, an older white man, a young Indigenous person of indeterminate gender. So, it's open now. Just as young people now march with their ancestors' badges on them, I think this play is also open to those kind of interpretations. And when you think about a young Asian woman who perhaps wasn't born in Australia reenacting something like that, that's actually quite a radical concept when you consider the conservative nature of this material that I'm playing with. But I want it to be fun as well too, and it will be a fun piece. So the next phase, I've got to write the thing, give it to the dramaturgs, we'll read it, because there's nothing like having a play read to help you work it out. Here it is. My current task is working out sort of chasing the dialogue through the piece with different coloured pens, working out who says what and what it all means. So, and there's also a song as well too. There's a song, Hero of Dardanelles, which was published around about that time, but there's another conversation there. The outcome hopefully will be some set of production, and maybe a publication as well too, just like The Holidays was published. I think that's the end of my presentation. So unless you have any questions or responses, then thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for being part of this thing about creative practice. And now I'm going to read it to you.
So with the dialogue of your characters, it's a contemporary voice, so you're trying to replicate the kind of voice of the time. As you said, you did a lot of looking letters and
I think I've made some effort to not use not to go too far in terms of operisms, but also not to have anyone say that anything is gnarly. So there's sort of a specificity of language there. But the more it's moved towards a reenactment of a reenactment, what's interesting is not the language itself, but how the actors approach it. So I'm interested in how a young Asian woman, for instance, might approach some of this dialect in the knowledge that we can see that she is approaching that dialect. So I like that challenge of watching really good actors pretend to be bad actors. That's the kind of layered sort of play I want to play with, where we acknowledge that the audience is the co-producer of the work. They know what's going on. So yes, no one says anything's gnarly. And
but
there is.
say, what's my motivation for lighting a cigarette after I'm dead?
That's for creative development. I'm not sure how much of the layers of reenactment will be revealed to each other or acknowledged. Because I don't plays about theatre are terrible. The only thing worse are films about writers. So yeah, I want to be playful with that. But thank you, it's a good question. I have made some effort to, and it's a very rich vernacular, that kind of language, but also can be quite violent too when you move into these potential depictions of racism as well too. And that's, even though it's just a small thread of the work, I've got concerns about some of the language in the work, and it's noted in the script as well for the safety of the reader. Thanks for your question, mate.
Like to see it.
Yeah. Will it have audience interaction then? Will the audience become the reenactors, or and vice versa?
I am interested in audience involvement in the work, and The Holidays did have a moment of sort of sonic symbolism in the work, where the audience going shh provided the sound of the sea. The sea is in everything I'm writing at the moment. I should just go and visit it or something. But that happened during peak COVID, and there was a point where and there was a moment where objects were being passed through the audience, and COVID just put paid to anything like that. But the sonic symbolism still existed there. Gavin came to see the work, thank you. So he was aware of how that worked. But at this stage, I'm not anticipating it for that reason at this time, but acknowledging the audience as co-creators, but also making sure that would make sense to a group of people in Paris. So I know maybe Paris isn't a good choice because Australia and France have got a strong sort of history of military friendship. But people who don't have the immediate context of what the Anzac legend is would still understand what's going on. I think that's the most important thing that I want to do. I don't want it to be just speaking to the initiated. All right, thanks for being part of my total nerding out about this, and for being part of one of the few moments of exegesis that the work is going to carry.
All right, well, with that done, thank you very much, Elizabeth and David, for both your presentations and keeping this seminar going, and for everybody attending today. I might close the formal element of this. Everybody's welcome to stay in the room. We'll sign off for our Zoom participants. And as mentioned, this has been recorded and will be available for playback with all the other seminars that we've had today. So with that, I'll close this session, but you're welcome to stay here for a little bit longer if we want to just have a bit more discussion on anything that's come up now. So thank you again, and please one more round of applause for both of these.